Today, I want to tell you about David Hammons. He's a really important, interesting, clever, simultaneously confounding and yet straightforward artist who's been producing work for the last 60 years or so, and he's still going strong. He's one of the reasons why I am so obsessed with hair. The meaning of hair, why it's so important and interesting that we humans keep on returning to it in our art, rituals, legends, and rules. This is the detangler, where the whole point is to detangle hair when we're confronted with it in these fascinating and surprising ways. I saw this piece and I was blown away by it because it's so funny and big and scary and creepy. It's like a gigantic spider made out of dreadlocks. And yes, I said dreadlocks there instead of locks because that's the word that was used in the 90s when this was made, and because I think David Hammons probably did want to instill some sort of dread in the people who were looking at it. This was originally shown at Documenta, which is an important contemporary art show that happens every 5 years in Germany. And in the 90s, when this was first shown, they probably didn't have a whole lot of work from Black artists. So seeing this massive spider made out of dreadlocks must have been shocking. Hammons had been a steady player in the Black arts movement for decades already, but he had only just recently been introduced to the mainstream, that is, white art scene. 2 years before, in 1990, he had a big retrospective at PS1, which was like the creme de la creme of the avant-garde. It has now been subsumed by the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. And that same year, he also received a MacArthur grant, also known as the Genius Grant. So all of a sudden, he was the darling of the art world. And I don't think he was all that comfortable with that. He said, "As an artist, I am not aligned with the collectors or the dealers or the museums. I see them all as frauds." This wasn't the first time he used black hair in his art. He collected it from salons in Harlem and used it along with other detritus from Black American life into what he called tragic magic, where he turned it into something new and powerful. I love how the hair comes together to create a life of its own, like a monster. And it's not the first time we've seen hair become the monster on the detangler, because hair is both human and not human. It takes on the memory and the meaning of all the people who grew it, but it's not alive anymore. It's almost like a zombie now. It's amazing to me how hair becomes so powerful and scary just from being off the body. This big black hair beast is bigger than you. It's confronting you. What do you think it's saying? Here's an earlier piece where Hammons used hair. He took tufts of black hair and attached them to sticks of wires and then planted them on the beach. And it's so beautiful and serene, like pussy willows. Until you realize they're not plants, they're hair, black hair. And then maybe that makes you think less of pussy willows and more of cotton, which black people were forced to pick as slaves. And then this piece becomes a little bit less serene and a lot more sad. This piece was ephemeral. It was washed away by the waves shortly after it was made, and it would have been completely forgotten were it not for these beautiful photos of the performance. Because Hammons was no dummy, he brought his photographer friend along, Bruce Talamon, to document the whole thing. Because, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, did it even happen? Hammons wanted to make sure that this was heard. That said, apparently he often just wanders around observing and making art out of things. So who knows how many pieces of Hammons' work we've not had the luck to see because he just didn't bring his photographer friend along. To Hammons, art is meant to be ephemeral. It shouldn't be quarantined in a stuffy museum or gallery. It should be out in the street, out in the air you breathe. It should be wherever you look. He was influenced by the Dadaist Marcel Duchamp in that regard, who taught the art world that if an artist designates something as art, then maybe it is. And Hammons has said that, "I can't stand art, actually. I've never, ever liked art." And yet the art scene pays the bills, so you can see why David Hammons must feel conflicted. One of his most cheeky pieces is this one, which doesn't involve hair, but it's so cool I would be sad not to show it to you. And it really illustrates very well how he straddles the world between the art world and the whatever you want to call art is art world. You know how in some cities people will spread out a blanket and then just sell whatever junk they have lying around? Well, David Hammons did that with snowballs in winter. He charged more for the bigger ones. I wish I could have been there and bought one and stuck it in my freezer. And by calling it a blizzard ball sale, he's thumbing his nose at the snooty art world who'll put a price on anything. Once again, he brought his fancy photographer friend, this time Dawoud Bey, to document it. And he keeps doling out these little tidbits to just keep the art world hooked and see what might happen next. David Hammons is savvy. He plays the art scene with this tantalizing push-pull. He's known for being elusive. He almost never gives interviews. He's not associated with any particular gallery, and he's been known to turn down shows at big, prestigious museums. And if he ever does agree to do a show, it's always with some sort of secrecy demands. It makes you wonder how he's been so successful when he refuses to play the game. He's not too difficult. He's reliable. His demands aren't that outrageous. I think his reticence plays in his favor because he makes you draw your own conclusions. It's not like his work is so abstract that you struggle to understand what it's about. He never explicitly spells out who his art is directed at or what sort of message they're supposed to take from it. And because he's so private and aloof with his interviews, he's not there to help you out with an interpretation. It's up to you what you want to make of it. Like with this billboard-sized painting where he put Jesse Jackson in whiteface with blonde hair and blue eyes. Jesse Jackson is an activist. He was a really important politician, probably the most prominent black politician of the time. He ran for president twice in the 80s. So Hammons made him white and tagged it with a Kool Moe Dee rap lyric that was popular at the time. How you like me now? Basically, if I were white, then would you vote for me? How you like me now? This was part of a group show in Washington, D.C., and David Hammons was the only artist to put his work on public property. Again, letting his work breathe in the real world rather than in a stuffy museum. But he strategically placed it in a parking lot facing the National Portrait Gallery, where most of the portraits were of white people. So it's kind of pointedly asking the question, someone of Jesse Jackson's caliber would probably have his portrait in there. Why not him? But before it was even finished being installed, a group of black men took sledgehammers to it and destroyed this. They didn't know that the artist was black. They didn't notice that it was facing off with the National Portrait Gallery. They just saw their hero, Jesse Jackson, in whiteface. They assumed it was racist, and they were offended. It's not necessarily the reaction you might have expected, but it's a totally valid one. I mean, you can see their perspective. Hammons didn't speak out about it at all. He didn't try to defend himself or the art or the people who attacked it. He thought that the less he said about it, the more the story would tell itself. Ultimately, he made the reaction part of the artwork. He let the dialogue continue. Whenever he shows this piece now, it's always surrounded by a row of sledgehammers. And that's kind of been his philosophy overall, to let the art speak for itself while he personally remains elusive. One theory as to why he's so elusive is that there's no point in him giving interviews while the art world is reducing black people to just stereotypes. They need him more than he needs them, and he doesn't want to play that game. He doesn't want to be reduced to a soundbite or a token gesture. He'll just be ambiguous and let you sort out the meaning. He did several stone heads, which give credence to this theory. If you're trying to depict a person, the most basic thing you can do is like a stick figure or a logo with just a simple round head, right? And that means that you get to put all of your preset defaults onto who this figure is trying to represent. So Hammons took the most featureless head he could find, a rock, and he put some hair on it. And now all of a sudden, this rock, this head, has a backstory. Whatever preset defaults you were imagining gets disrupted because this head now is a black man. Was that your default? Did you think your default was neutral? Are you filling in all the blanks now about this particular black man? This otherwise featureless rock with just the addition of some hair makes you think, makes you wonder about the person it's trying to represent and the people it's trying to represent, and about the difference between your imagination, whether this rock as head has or doesn't have distinctly black hair. He followed the same idea more obviously but less famously with his redesign of the Major League Baseball logo. Here, that silhouette that you probably thought of as neutral before suddenly becomes distinctly black. How does that change the way you think of this logo, this sport, this pointy nose as neutral? Hair is such a distinguishing characteristic. Hammons is able to give this dumb as rock a personality just because he makes you stop and think about it as an individual. David Hammons is in his 80s now. A lot has changed in the world and in the art world since he was coming up as an artist during the civil rights movement. He actually gave one of his rare interviews just a few years ago, and he talked about Trump. He said, "Now at least we have the truth. Yes, Trump is the truth about America, because America has been like this forever. White people haven't seen it before, but we have." I assume David Hammons will just keep on observing, commenting in his art, and leaving it to us to interpret. If you want to know more about David Hammons, there's a documentary that you can watch in the US on Apple TV or Amazon Plus. It's unfortunately not available here in the UK, and I'm not sure about other countries. It's called The Melt Goes On Forever, and if you watch it, let me know. Tell me what you think, okay? And if you see an old black guy wandering around who's just observing everything but not saying much, maybe in Brooklyn or Yonkers or maybe some part of Japan, tell him hi from the Detangler.